Day 3 for them, and these employees tell us that they are fighting for better wages and staffing. As we reported, an estimated 31,000 frontline Kaiser workers went on strike Tuesday. It is a 5-day strike happening all across California, Hawaii, and Oregon. It is the largest strike ever by the United Nurses Associations of California and Healthcare Professionals Union.
Hi guys, it's Jason here, and welcome back to the channel. I felt like it was time for me to actually talk about what's going on in the headlines. And you guys already know me as the nurse that works at Kaiser Permanente because you've seen it in my videos. You've probably been able to deduce that from these videos. So I've done nothing but praise Kaiser for the last 8 years or so since I've worked for them. And that's because had it not been for this organization, my wife and I would not be in the position we're in today. You know, we feel blessed, to be honest with you. It's one of the only places that I've ever worked at that actually maintains their nurse-to-patient ratios, at least in my facility. The same cannot be said for other facilities. I don't know, I've never worked in the other facilities. But, you know, I work in an ER, and my ratios are pretty solid. It's 1 to 4 in the ER for patients that are like, let's say, tele patients, med-surg patients. If I get a critical patient, it's gonna be a 1-to-1 until that patient stabilizes, and then it becomes a 1 to 2. And then if we have a step-down patient, it's 1 to 3. Now, one thing that's happening, and you know what, I should also mention my salary because I think that's gonna be important. So I make $110 per hour. And Monica, she's a nurse too, she's my wife. She makes $142 an hour and she's a per diem nurse. So as a per diem nurse, like that's unheard of anywhere else in the US. I was just talking to a former coworker of mine who lives and works in New York City. And one thing she told me recently is that she's making about $149,000 a year and she's working about 46 hours a week, with 36 or 37 and a half of those being from a benefited position and the other portion being from a per diem job that she has at another facility. So she's working 2 jobs and she's making $149,000 a year. Meanwhile, I have this one job. I work about 20 hours a week. And as a matter of fact, like this past year, I've only worked about 16 and a half hours. And I'm already gonna be at 120 to 130, maybe even 140,000 by the end of this year. And Monica works about 18 hours a week. I mean, by the end of the year, it's probably gonna be a lot less than that because she hasn't been getting a lot of hours this year. But combined, we're making about $250,000 a year to maybe $300,000 a year. And the same thing could not be said about the healthcare professionals and the nurses in Southern California. So in Northern California, these nurses are represented by the California Nurses Association. And the California Nurses Association is also the nurses union that's responsible for the nurse-to-patient ratios that we have in California. That is something that I wish we would have everywhere else in the country. I came from New York City where there are strong unions, but not as strong as the California Nurses Association. And the same thing is happening with nurses who work in Southern California because these nurses who work down there are represented by a different union. And they're represented by the United Nurses Association of California. And there's another union too that went on strike, and that's the Union for Healthcare Professionals. And that union is the union that represents pharmacists, physical therapists, and many other healthcare professionals. So the problem that they're having down there is that in addition to the fact that they don't get paid as well as we do in Northern California, they're fighting for better ratios. They're fighting for better staffing. And let me explain what I mean by that. So in California right now, there is a law that strictly prohibits employers from giving nurses more than a certain number of patients. I just explained to you what my ratios are in the ER. And that's because Kaiser abides by those state ratios. However, in Southern California, there is a different set of ratios. These nurses have a higher standard, right? So like if you're an ER nurse, instead of having a 1 to 4 ratio, you're gonna have a 1 to 3 ratio. And there are many other factors to that, but this is just an example of what I'm talking about. Their ratios are a lot more strict than the ratios that the state of California has implemented. And I totally understand why they're fighting for better ratios like that. A lot of the talking points they have in their negotiations is that the reason why nurses leave is twofold. One, they're paid a fraction of what nurses in Northern California are getting paid. Same goes for the pharmacists, physical therapists, and all these other professionals. And then two, they feel as though staff members leave because they're overworked. And it just becomes a cycle of all these staff members continuously leaving. So the ones that stay behind have to pick up the slack for a fraction of the pay that nurses in Northern California get paid. And I heard people say in my videos, like, why are Kaiser nurses going on strike if they're getting paid so well? And What those people don't realize is that Northern California nurses get paid well, not Southern California nurses. One thing that the union is asking for is a 25% increase over the next 4 years. And what the organization has come back with is a 21.5% increase over the next 4 years. They say that this is justifiable because it aligns with the rate of inflation. The rate of inflation as of the last 12 months in 2025 has gone up by 2.9%. In 2024, it was 2.9%. 2023, 3.4%. In 2022, 6.5%. So obviously, it was 6.5% in the previous year. It was even higher than that. It was 7%. The reason for that is because of COVID, obviously. COVID is not here anymore. The rate of inflation has gone down. But before those years, in 2020, the rate of inflation was 1.4. And let me just see if I can show you guys right here, right? So, like these years right here, on this side right here, that's when the rate of inflation was the lowest, and that was pre-COVID. So as you can see, the rate of inflation has actually increased dramatically. But over the last 4 years, the rate of inflation is 15.7%. Kaiser is offering 21.5%, so it is above the rate of inflation. However, if you still factor in the amount of money that nurses in Northern California are getting paid and compare it to what nurses in Southern California are going to get paid, if this raise takes effect, they're still getting paid a lot less than the Northern California nurses. And I'll give you an example. A Southern California nurse, I believe they start off at something like $60 an hour, somewhere around that number. But if you have a Kaiser nurse who's in Northern California, that nurse starts somewhere in the range of like $83, $84 an hour. As a night shift nurse in Northern California, your initial rate as a new grad is as much as about $93, $94, or even $95 an hour. That is nowhere near the amount of where these Southern California nurses are going to be, even with them factoring in this raise. So it's understandable that they want to do this. All right, let me just give you some key facts so you can make up your own mind about whether they should get these raises or not. Okay, in 2024, Kaiser profited $12.9 billion. In 2023, it was $4.1 billion. So in that time frame, just 2 years, Kaiser has been able to make a profit of over $17 billion. And I keep saying this, but again, I'm trying to look at this from an objective standpoint. I myself believe that I get paid a decent salary. It's more than decent because I compare myself to nurses all across this country who make a median salary of $93,600 a year. And that's nurses who are working over 36 hours a week. But a lot of nurses nationwide are making under $50, even $40 an hour. I spoke to a nurse recently who works in Alabama who makes $29 an hour. She got a 4-year degree and she's making $29 an hour. And if you know how difficult and challenging it is to be a nurse, $29 an hour is a damn shame for a nurse to be getting paid that much. And I know people who work at Costco in California who make more than that. They make like $33, $34 an hour. So when you have a nurse, and obviously, you know, you got to factor in the cost of living, right? That's why I made an app to allow nurses to be able to compare their cost of living and their pay so that they know how much they can actually keep at the end of the day and not just how much they're earning. Because a lot of these nurses are factoring in the cost of living in Southern California, and when they account for the cost of living, after they get paid, they realize that they're barely able to make ends meet. Whereas you have nurses in Northern California where, yes, the cost of living is high, but thankfully, the nurses union in Northern California has worked so hard to make sure that they secure wages that allow nurses to have a decent place to live and not have to live paycheck to paycheck. This is the problem we're having in this country. You know, during COVID, everyone was praising nurses, right? But when it comes to nurses getting paid what they deserve, that's a completely different story. And I want you to just go on Zillow, and I want you to type in San Diego, California, and I want you to look for homes in that area and see how much you can purchase a home for in that area. And then do the same thing for Sacramento, California. Do the same thing for Roseville, California. Do the same thing for Fresno, California. Now, I know these places are not as desirable to live as San Diego, but there are Kaiser hospitals in these locations, and they pay nurses nearly twice as much. I mean, look, I just told you my wife makes $142 an hour. The highest paid per diem nurse in Southern California at Kaiser might make $90 an hour. So, you know, when you take a look at these numbers, I want you to then ask yourself, is it justifiable that they're going on strike? And I want you to let me know in the comment section below. Let me know what it is that you think. And remember, it's not just the nurses that we need to support, because there's physician assistants, there's physical therapists, pharmacists, all these healthcare practitioners that are on strike for better wages, better staffing, and all these other things. All right, so let me know in the comment section what you think. All right, see you guys on the next one.